In this part of the video, I want to talk about field studies. Field studies are studies in which a researcher observes behavior and collects data out in the field, rather than in a laboratory setting. So in field studies, a researcher goes to some public or real-world location, rather than in some controlled environment. And I want to talk about three types of field studies in this video: naturalistic observation, participant observation, and unintrusive measures. I'll define each of these and provide at least one example of each, and then after that, I want to compare naturalistic and participant observation directly and talk about the pros and cons of each. So let's start with naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation is a type of field study in which a researcher observes behavior in some natural, public, or real-world location while remaining hidden and unnoticed. So imagine I'm teaching a class, and I go over to the classroom window, and I decide to observe people walking down the sidewalk. And let's say I'm looking for something like scooter accidents, or something else that I'm interested in. And let's also say I write down a few notes of what I observe on the sidewalk. If I did that, I would be doing a little bit of naturalistic observation, right? Because the people on the sidewalk can't see me, they don't know that I'm watching them, so I am a hidden observer, at least I'm pretty sure I am. And also the people walking down the sidewalk are going about their lives in a natural setting, so that would be naturalistic observation. And when you do naturalistic observation, it's important to be a hidden observer because you want the behaviors that you're observing to actually be natural. You want to get a glimpse of how people behave as they go about their lives in a natural environment that's not intruded upon by a researcher. When people know that they're being watched, they don't behave completely naturally. And you don't want to just record how people behave when they know that they're being watched by a researcher. You want to record natural behaviors. So that's why it's so important to be a hidden observer. You don't want biased observations. And there are two different options for how to be a hidden observer in naturalistic observation. First, you could literally hide in a hidden spot or hidden location. You could hide under a table, behind a window, or behind a store directory or something like that. Or you could set up hidden cameras in the setting that you would like to observe. And the IRB actually approves of that as long as no identifying information is being recorded. So identifying information includes things like names, social security numbers, student ID numbers, anything that can be used to trace a person, basically. So when you're recording a behavior in a natural setting through hidden cameras, you can't know any of that information about the people that actually end up in your recording. So let's say 5 people end up in your video recording. You can't know the names of those 5 people. You can't know their student ID numbers. You can't know their social security numbers. All you're allowed to know is that these are 5 people who happen to be in this setting, and they happen to end up in my video. And if that's the case, then the IRB does approve of that method. So yeah, that's how naturalistic observation works. You can do naturalistic observation of human behavior. You can also observe animal behavior in a naturalistic way. For example, if you're on a college campus, you might observe squirrels walking across the campus. There's actually a lot of squirrels where I teach, so I could definitely do some naturalistic observation of squirrel behavior, as long as they don't know that I'm watching them, right? I still have to be a hidden observer. Now, I'd like to move ahead and talk about participant observation. Participant observation is when a researcher actually becomes a member of the group that he or she is studying. So if a researcher gets a job at a certain company just to observe and study his or her coworkers, that's participant observation. If a person gets a job at Google just to learn more about Google employees and their culture, that's participant observation. And it's called participant observation because the researcher becomes an active participant in the group. The researcher participates in the group's regular daily activities. So I think that the wording might be a little bit confusing here because usually in a research methods class, you think of a participant as being someone who's being observed, not the observer, right? You think of a participant as a research subject. So it might help you to think about it this way. In participant observation, the researcher becomes a member of a group and participates with the participants. That might help you to think of it that way, participating with the participants. And unobtrusive measures is a type of field study in which a researcher doesn't observe behavior directly, but instead looks for clues or evidence that's been left behind in the environment. So let's say I'm teaching a class and I want to learn about what students are eating in that classroom. So I go to the trash can and I look around, and maybe I see some empty bottles of water, maybe I see a sandwich wrapper, maybe I see some other types of leftover items. If I did that, I would be doing unobtrusive measures. I would be trying to learn about behavior in a certain setting by looking for evidence that's been left behind. And there are some pros and cons of using this method. If you don't observe people directly, there are some advantages to that. You don't have to be a hidden observer. You don't have to go through all the effort of being a hidden observer or all of the inconvenience that's involved in that. You don't have to deceive people. You don't have to lie like you would in participant observation and pretend like you're actually a true member of a group when you're really not. So yeah, there are some pros of not needing to observe people directly, but the main disadvantage of unobtrusive measures is the fact that when you don't observe people directly, you miss out on some important or useful information. You don't get the complete picture of what's actually happening as the behaviors unfold, and you might have to do some guesswork to put the puzzle pieces together. Imagine I'm in that classroom again, and I want to know what students are eating in class. And I go to the trash can, and I see some bottled water that's been left behind, or some empty bottles of water. Well, before I can conclude that students are drinking bottled water in class, I have to make at least one assumption. I have to assume that all trash that's in that trash can has been left by students. And that might or might not be true. It might be that someone did come into the room randomly and just threw their trash away and then left. It could be that someone was looking for a trash can and said, I'll just go in a classroom and use their trash can. And if someone has done that, then the trash that I'm looking at, that I'm observing, is not all from students. So you do have to make some assumptions if you're just looking at evidence that's been left behind. And before we move on, I wanted to share an example of an unobtrusive measures study that you could do at your university. So they've actually found some evidence that people cut across lawns or campus lawns on their way to class as a shortcut. And I think the reason why they do that is because the sidewalks are often square corners, and it's much faster to just cut a triangle and go across the lawn than to actually walk around that square corner. If you wanted to see whether students are cutting across the lawn and making a diagonal line at your campus, you could actually go out to the lawn and look for trails that have been left behind. And if you see a diagonal trail across the lawn, then that tells you that students are probably walking across the lawn. If you did that, that would be unobtrusive measures. Now, if you went to a hidden location and observed people to see if people are walking across the lawns, that wouldn't be unobtrusive measures. That would now be naturalistic observation. Okay, so now let's move ahead and talk about the pros, at least a few pros and cons of naturalistic and participant observation. So the following are advantages of naturalistic observation over participant observation. First of all, you get to observe natural behavior in naturalistic observation. When a person becomes a member of the group, that person is technically an intruder. So when a person does participant observation, they're intruding on the group, and the behaviors that the person observes aren't completely natural because they've been affected by that new member being added to the group, which is the researcher. But in naturalistic observation, you actually get to observe behavior unfolding naturally without intrusion by the researcher. Second, you get more objective conclusions, or you tend to get more objective conclusions, because when a person is a hidden observer, they tend to be more cool-headed and detached and objective because they don't know the people that they're observing. they don't really care if they reach positive or negative conclusions about those people, probably. But when a person becomes a member of a group and actually spends time with them, like in participant observation, the researcher might develop some relationships and some intimacy with the group members, and that might bias the conclusions. So yeah, you do tend to get more objective conclusions in naturalistic observation. There's also less deception. Participant observation is done covertly, which means that the researcher doesn't tell the group that he or she joined that they're a researcher, because that would affect the behavior of the group, and it would affect the results of the study. But there isn't that deception in naturalistic observation, because you don't interact with the people you're observing at all. Now, some people might argue that the act of being a hidden observer is a little bit deceptive, because you're observing people who don't know that they're being observed, but I would still say that it's much less deceptive than participant observation. Now let's talk about the pros, the advantages of participant observation over naturalistic. So first of all, in participant observation, you get to interact with the people in the group that you've joined. You get to ask them questions and learn about their thoughts, feelings, history, their cultural beliefs. And you can't get any of that in-depth information in naturalistic observation because you're not talking with the people that you're observing. Second, in participant observation, there's no need to go through the inconvenience and difficulty of being a hidden observer because you're joining the group and becoming a member of the group, so there's no need to hide. So I just highlighted some advantages of naturalistic, and I also highlighted some advantages of participant observation. So yeah, that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll wrap up and we'll talk about a few major differences between quantitative research and qualitative research in general.